Nick, welcome to the Resilient Man podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here, James. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate you coming down and doing it in person, which I love as well.
Well, I love being on podcasts. I think just being able to have curious conversations is really powerful for the listener. I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, but when you can do it in person, as opposed to, on Zoom or Teams or whatever, I think it's just that extra bit special. So I'm really happy to be here.
100%. And I think we see people on the screens all the time, don't we?
We do.
Especially from COVID era and stuff like that. So it's nice to be in a room with you as well. So the Resilient Man podcast, it's all about those moments of struggle, adversity, those really key turning points in your life. And the whole idea of it is for other men who are listening, realise that they're not alone. Other people have been through similar challenges, and I'm going to be trying to draw out those key things that really helped you for the listeners. So what are those 2 or 3 key turning moments for you?
God, it's so hard when someone asks you a question about that to be really specific and say it was this, this and this, but I'll do my best for you. I think I'd probably start by saying that for me, there were probably 3 things that had a big impact on me growing up. I think the first thing was growing up in a faith household, where the version of faith that I was grown up with was very much about right and wrong and not an awful lot of room to navigate one and the other. So I remember being kind of feeling a lot that I was bad, but not quite understanding why. And there wasn't room to really explore that. I'd say the second thing was my primary school experience. I'm 51, which means I'm old enough to have gone to school in the days where, physical punishment was allowed. And I experienced that a few times, and that was difficult. But also because my dad was a teacher at the school. So I got to see sort of 2 versions of my father growing up. One was kind of a really well-revered teacher, funny, witty, really engaging, and well-liked. And he was like that at home, but that's not all he was at home. We saw a lot of frustration, a lot of kind of being able to express all of the things, the frustrations of the job, the stresses of the job at home. So at home growing up, there was a lot of what I now know as hypervigilance. I'd have said then just, being careful when to be with my dad and when not to be with my dad. And also that duality kind of taught me, even though I didn't know it at the time, it taught me that wearing masks is normal. Not being able to be ourselves in all parts of our life was normal, which went on to have a big impact. The third thing was football. It was the thing I loved to do the most. I happened to be very good at it. And between the age of 10 and 19, I played with and against some of the best players of my generation, which on the one hand was a really brilliant experience, but it also meant that I grew up being conditioned that 100% performance was the bare minimum, and anything less than that meant I was letting myself down. So a kind of combination of all of those things meant that obviously I grew out of school, I grew out of my faith, the older I got into my teenage years, but when football went, I was left with just nothing. And I found that really hard. That's the first time I really struggled mentally and emotionally, I think.
Was it always a goal for you to become a professional football player?
It was, especially when I was younger. I was lucky enough to go through the academies at Spurs and then Luton and then Watford and then Reading and then played some non-league football at Stevenage. In the beginning, it was all I ever wanted to be. But probably when I went into adolescence, it became the thing I had to become. And I really felt that pressure. And there were parts of me there were parts of me that had other interests, which I kind of put to one side. So interests like music and reading and things that didn't really fit the image of what was portrayed to me were acceptable as a footballer. So you kind of had to be that kind of stoic, laddie version of yourself, if you like. And even though I had some of those traits naturally, for me, it was quite difficult to maintain that as a front. And I think when anyone grows up having to be a version of themselves in order to feel acceptable, to feel safe, to feel of value, I think there's only a certain amount of time that that's sustainable. So yeah, it was definitely something I wanted to do, but the longer I did it, I wanted to do it less.
Interesting. And interesting with the masks as well, which you mentioned earlier on. So then almost you can see that you're almost wearing this mask to be this identity of the football player.
Yeah, because, I mean, look, none of us can be 100% authentic all of the time, especially when we're growing up and we're discovering who we are. So I think part of exploring that is just part of everybody's story. But I think to only allow yourself to be one version of yourself. But here's the crucial thing. Being that version of myself didn't feel good to me inside, but it got me a lot of friends, a lot of plaudits, a lot of validation from outside of me, which again was something that became really important as I grew into a man and some of my bigger struggles started to happen. It was that one of the words that I picked up in therapy that I love the most is congruence. And congruence means to be in alignment with what you're feeling inside yourself and how you're behaving out in the world. And that's something that is a big guide for me now. And when there's a disconnect, now I know that tells me that I have to take action of some kind to restore balance. Either I do some work on what's going on within me to relate to how I am outside, or vice versa. I need to make changes outside to bring myself back into harmony. But back then I didn't realize that. It was just a struggle that I lived through every day silently.
So you're constantly fighting against yourself almost. Head and heart, I guess, similar to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think when it's, to make that point again, because I think it's so crucial, I think a lot of men in particular struggle with this, that when people give us validation for how we show up, that feels good. We feel worthy. We feel of use. So we kind of, it becomes a little bit easier to do that more on the one hand. But when it isn't natural, that's what creates that internal conflict. And it's, no one shows us how to navigate that.
I like what you say about that congruence. How does somebody know if they're not congruent with them or aligned with themselves?
It's a really good question. And there's no simple answer to that, except for me, it's intuitive, and especially now. So it's like it's a feeling of when you exhibit a behavior, regardless of how that behavior is received, if you have a feeling of discomfort inside, maybe it's a feeling of guilt, maybe you've behaved in a way or cracked a joke that's got a lot of laughs, but maybe hasn't made someone feel great. You sense that, so you don't feel great. That for me is an indication of, well, is this who I want to be? If that doesn't bother you, then that's just part of who you are. And we can make judgments about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But for me, it's all about that inner experience based on how you act in the world.
So for somebody listening right now who's maybe feeling that disconnect, what advice would you give them?
I think first and foremost, lean into compassion rather than judgment.
Okay. When
we are brave enough, and I think it is a courageous thing, especially as men, because we're not shown how to do that. But when we meet ourselves where we are and we face the self-awareness of who we are, if there are parts of us that we don't like, we tend to be really judgmental. We tend to beat ourselves up, and we tend to then to want to push that away in some way. We want to ignore it. We want to maybe numb out from it, distract ourselves from it rather than face it. If we can face ourselves through a lens of compassion, and say, look, I may not like this part of myself, but I'm not going to judge myself for it. If I can lean into the idea that there are probably good reasons, as there were for me in football, to show up the way I showed up and for that incongruence to be created, when I can be compassionate towards that, it allows for change. When we push it away, when we ignore it, it just stays there, even if we get respite for a while. So my best piece of advice is be compassionate towards yourself and just accept that this is what's going on for you. When we can do that, it allows you to move forward from a place of honesty and realness.
I think that's possibly underestimated, that power of being compassionate for yourself. For me personally, I know I've get annoyed at myself because I've had high standards for myself of what I want to do, what I want to achieve. And when I feel like I'm not doing that or I'm not achieving that, I'm my own biggest critic. And there's not much self-compassion that gets in the way in between my self-criticism. So I think that's crucial.
I think it is. And don't get me wrong, I think it's really good to have ambition. to have goals for ourselves, to want to achieve things. I think that's great. I think it's really important. But it's about how we appraise our own experience as men. And that's what I'm really talking about in terms of that compassion. So when we fall short of what we think we're capable of, it's not about letting ourselves off the hook, but it's about not doubling down on the disappointment of falling short by being too critical, and noticing when we are critical and then trying to kind of sprinkle some compassion over that, because then it's more realistic. It's fairer. Because for me, certainly, and I was a big kind of critical person for a long time, all that does is create more pressure to be better, which in turn creates more internal feelings of not being good enough.
Yeah, and then that frustration, and it's almost like that negative cycle, and that you just get stuck in.
Exactly, and I know exactly what that feels like. You know, we touched on sort of leaving football at 19, but even though, you know, I had some good times in my life in my 20s and 30s, really, I now know I was just living that cycle over and over again in some way, shape or form. Whether it was my personal relationships, whether it was friendships, whether it was work, high periods of anxiety because I was worrying about, was I good enough? What's going to happen in the future? Is it all going to go wrong? A whole lot of energy went into that. But then there'd be periods of shutdown and depression where burnout is how I would describe it, of just it all being too much and then turning that inwards and just shutting down, really. I think depression, if you've experienced it, is one of the hardest experiences to recover from. So I want to honour anybody listening that is either there now or has been there, because even though it's unique and different for everybody, when you're in that state of shutdown, it's a very, very, very lonely place to exist in, even if you're surrounded by people.
Yeah. I mean, I've been there before as well, and it's probably from the support from my family, support and kind of pushing me towards like going to therapy.
Yeah.
And actually, I talk about this quite a lot, but we have to be willing to put our ego to one side sometimes as men.
Yes.
And accepting help.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that is the heart. It took me until I was 27 years old to ask for help for the first time in my life. And I now know that I could have saved myself a lot of pain, a lot of heartache if I'd had the courage to be able to do that. You know, growing up in the environments that I did, asking for help was associated with weakness. Even though I now know that asking for help is one of the most empowering things any of us can do, whether it's in relation to depression and mental health or even just generally, back then I couldn't make that association. I think that's why a lot of men don't ask for the help that they need and let it get to a place of crisis because of the same stigma.
It's interesting then, because we tend to typically talk about mental health, but you said like outside of that as well. And it made me think of like being at work and not wanting to ask for help because of fear of judgment of what you're doing, or you can't do that role, or what perceptions are they going to have if I ask for help? Yeah.
A lot of the work that I do in organisations with my partner Jess is around leadership. And there's often a misconception within, if you're a leader or a manager of people, that you have to know everything all of the time. But no one can know everything all of the time. And actually, if we create an environment where that's the case, everybody feels under pressure and no one can ask for help. And that's not just in the workplace. It can happen in relationships, in friendship groups. It's such a misconception. And that's why I love, and again, we often think that vulnerability means being weak. But for me, vulnerability means being real. All of us as human beings are good at some things. And it's not necessarily being bad at other things, but we might just be new to it. You know, unless you're very, very gifted and blessed, it's highly unlikely that starting anything for the first time, we're going to nail it. So again, I think for me, it's about reframing what we believe about the way things are inside us and outside of us that can give us a real freedom to just learn as we go. And I'm a big fan of psychological safety. And part of creating psychological safety for ourselves and in groups with other people is we have to accept that all of us are learning all of the time.
I like that. And I'm almost getting this like self-compassion kind of thread going through this conversation already.
And I think, again, that's really born from my own lived experience. You know, coming out of depression, it was self-compassion, being able to via therapy, understand how I had become the person that I'd become, that had led me to be feeling depressed and then being in that room in the first place. And kind of having got to a crisis point where I did reach out for help, I then had to go through the process of learning how to speak my truth like I'm doing now. That took a few weeks on its own. Even going to therapy is one thing, but actually being able to experience therapy is something completely different.
Yep.
And I think that's why sometimes a lot of people are brave enough to go through the door, but maybe not brave enough to stick it out. No, that's not the right term. They leave too early because they don't get immediate benefits from it.
That rings so true to me. I mean, I walked in, arms folded, again, opposite the counsellor therapist for a couple of weeks, but it wasn't until I let them in that I actually started working. So one thing I want to go back to briefly is, what can someone do practically to show themselves self-compassion?
So I think for me personally, it's about being able to know your truth and to be as balanced about that as possible. I really like to journal. Some people hear the word journaling and it makes them want to be a little bit sick in their own mouth, and that's okay if that's you listening. But journaling for me isn't just a book and a pen and writing out all of your stuff. There's many, many ways you can journal. One of my other favourite tools is an emotions wheel.
Okay.
So an emotions wheel is kind of what it says on the tin. It will have what I call the core emotions in the middle, like anger, sadness, happiness. The way most of us tend to just describe our emotional experiences, but as the wheel goes out, a bit like a dartboard, it has more nuanced emotions that make up the core emotions. For me, when I was able to understand the complexity of what it is to be a human being emotionally, like there are something like, I don't know, 260 emotions on that wheel or whatever it is. There's a lot. And a lot I'm still discovering. But when I can say, well, my anger that I feel might be made up of a bit of frustration or memories of humiliation and a whole range of other factors, suddenly rather than just writing off my description, my experience of I'm not feeling very well, I feel a bit depressed and I'm judging myself for that, and that's it, I can begin to say, this is really complex. It's difficult for anybody to manage and understand all of what's going on inside us. So for me, understanding that everybody has mental health, everybody has an ongoing emotional inner story playing out. Sometimes we feel like we don't have control of that or we don't understand it. And when all of that gets normalized, compassion just kind of seeps into it. It's not something you have to say, right, I'm gonna be compassionate. You know, we can bring that intention to our experience. But for me, journaling and an emotions wheel starts to give you the opportunity to take some of what is going on in here that you might be packaging up in a really simple way, and you start to see the complexity of what it is to be you.
Nice.
And that's really beautiful. And it also allows the page to hold some of what's going on in here.
I like it.
And that's really important.
So journaling.
Yes.
Is a phrase that gets thrown around quite a lot. How do you journal? How could someone just get started in journaling?
For sure. I think some people like to have prompts. So it might be that it says something like, today I'm grateful for, to start you off writing. And it automatically tunes you into, hopefully, something that you can find gratitude about. Gratitude tends to be tied up with journaling because it allows us to balance our experience. But it also might be more functional. It might be, these are the things that I know I need to do today. And it lets the page hold that instead of you having to constantly remember what it is you have to do. So it has a functional element to it as well. One of my favourite ways of journaling is something called rage on a page, which is quite literally, if I find myself in a high emotional state, especially if it's something like frustration or anger or resentment, letting myself have the freedom and the privilege to express exactly what that is on the page calms me down just through that act. Even if what I write might be quite hideous to read back, it's not about being able to read it back. We're not writing Shakespeare with any of this stuff. No one else is going to see it. And sometimes with that last one, it's not even about writing words. Sometimes it's about expressing myself with my body and a pen and just scribbling. Allowing that release makes a massive difference. Some people like to write narratives. So it becomes almost like a story, a reflective story of what's happened to you that day, that week. That can be really useful because you can begin to see common threads. Some people, as I said, like to use it from a more forward-thinking view of these are my goals that I need to do today, but it might also be about aspirations or intentions. It might be saying to myself, right, I'm going to give myself and use creativity to imagine a version of myself in 3 months' time or 6 months' time or a year's time. Who would I like to be?
So would you say it's just picking up a pen and paper and just...
In its most simplest form, it's exactly that.
Yeah.
And I think as long as what hits the paper is real for you, whatever that is, it's a worthwhile exercise.
So I don't journal all the time, but I have journaled in the past. And I picked up an old notebook. Yeah. And what was really interesting was reading where I was in like 2022, at a point where I was struggling, and then having that, this is how far I've come. Because I think for me, like day to day, I'm like, oh, am I making progress?
Yeah.
And I think when we're so zoomed in, you can feel like you're not. Having that moment of like self-reflection, reading back through where I was, what I was struggling with back then, to where I am now, I found quite, I don't know, it gave me a good feeling to see how far I'd come.
That's beautiful. Could I ask you a question about that? So if when you were reading and reflecting on that earlier version of you, a version of you that was struggling, like what feelings came up for you towards that younger version of you?
Yeah, compassion.
Exactly. This is another reason to journal, because you can begin to sort of reflect on who you used to be and view that version of you, especially if it's a version of you which was in struggle, maybe feeling stuck or whatever it might be. You view it differently. And that's really important.
What was interesting is when I was reading it, I could feel what I was feeling then. It almost like took me back to where I was. So I need to kind of journal more. I think I should journal more. But that one instance, I can see the benefits from it. Beautiful,
beautiful. There's so many other things you can do as well. But I think definitely one of the themes with the work that I do is something called self-leadership. And what I mean by that is if we think of the self as on any given day, if I'm not stressed, if I'm not under pressure, all that kind of stuff, if someone doesn't cut me up on the road, like whatever it might be, if this is who I know myself to be, these are my values, this is what I believe in, this is how my partner, friends, family know me. And self-leadership is being able to notice when we step outside of that version of ourselves for whatever reason. Maybe it is because I'm stressed or under pressure or someone's cut me up on the road. And I think that one of the terms that I love the most, which relates to what you're saying about looking back at a former self, is being able to notice opportunities to reparent ourselves is what I call it. It's about the version of ourselves in the present that's aligned with who we are, being able to connect to past versions of ourselves that may have been in struggle, and you can feel that connection. But it's almost like a dual experience. That's not all you feel. So when you were actually struggling, that was probably all you could feel. But now you can feel who you are now, and you're connecting to a version of yourself. And I think that reparenting connection is so beautiful because it allows you to honour that version of yourself that got you to where you are now. So you can begin to kind of reframe and value that experience in a different way. Yep. So I look back on my experiences of struggle now, and I'm grateful for them because I wouldn't be who I am now without those experiences, even though they were horrific at times to live through. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of coming through the other side.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's probably why we're both in this space, trying to help other people, whether it be podcast, coaching, through our own struggles.
I think a lot of people go into any kind of helping profession because of exactly that. I think it's really important. I like the 3 M's of mess, message, and mission. So whatever it is that you had to struggle through, when you come out of the other side of it, it gives you a message. And I think sometimes that then gives you like a an inner desire that you didn't choose to have that makes you want to then be of service in some way to other people that might benefit from who you are now. And I think it's a really noble thing for anybody to do, whatever it might be that you actually end up doing.
Absolutely. So I want to go back because we've been reflecting back, but I want to take us back. So I had a similar experience to you. So yours was to be the football player. Mine was getting to the Royal Marines. So I told everyone at school that's what I was going to do. Wrote it in my yearbook and I didn't get in. So what I'd like to know from you is, so did you choose to not proceed going, or did you not get in?
There were so many quick rejections, fallouts, that eventually the last choice was mine.
Okay.
But it didn't really feel like a choice.
Okay, so it was more that you was put in that position.
Yeah, I think so. Like, just to give you some brief detail, I mentioned the clubs that I'd been with. When I was 16, a few weeks before my GCSEs, I got rejected by Watford. I didn't get offered an academy scholarship, which is what it's known as now. And it was like my whole world had ended. The moment I was told that, it was like a grenade going off in a war film and I couldn't hear anything else. There were just mouths talking at me. And all I remember, and I'm tuning into that feeling now, like we were just talking about, all I can remember is don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, and get out of that room. I was lucky enough to then go on trial at Reading and get the contract that Watford didn't want to give me. But Reading was a horrific experience of a different kind. And I left there after just a year in sort of quite difficult circumstances. And I think after that, when I was playing semi-professionally at Stevenage as a young player, I found suddenly playing men's football incredibly difficult. And I was struggling then with a lot of the experiences I've already touched upon in this pod. And we're starting to numb out from my own experiences, because the tide started to change when I'd stopped becoming the thing that everybody thought I was going to become and who I thought I was going to become. So for me, how I dealt with that was to embrace alcohol and tobacco and weed and then other stuff as well after that.
Because that's what I was going to come to, is where does that leave you? So like you pin your hopes and dreams on something, which I think a lot of sort of younger people have ambitions of what they want to achieve, and life doesn't always go the way we plan it. So where did that leave you? You touched on there a little bit there.
It left me with, there's a beautiful term that I came across relatively recently for anybody that, as they're growing up, forms an identity. This self I was talking about, for me, my self growing up was, I am a footballer. Not I play football, not I want to play professional football. I am a footballer. So when that was no longer there, the term that I've come to really love is there's an identity foreclosure. Your identity shuts down because it's no longer living. But then what are you left with? It was such a big part of my identity that I didn't know what was there. There was like a void, and I tried to fill that void with whatever I could. Some of it was drugs, alcohol. Some of it was trying to find other passions, but nothing ever really filled it. That was my experience. So what was yours?
So a little bit like you, I was lost. I essentially locked myself away for like, I think it was 3 or 4 months. So I didn't socialise because I told everybody that I was going to be a Royal Marine, and I couldn't face people and tell people that I'd failed. And what kind of made it worse is a friend I was training with got through and he passed it. And then, because I went again like 3 months after to try again, but I hadn't recovered mentally from the first time.
Yeah.
So I still had those seeds of doubt, that I am a failure, because despite me being there for the second time and going through it, I still had those seeds of doubt, those limiting beliefs. And so it didn't work out a second time. And again, a guy who was from college with, he went on and got in. I was just like, so I couldn't see anybody. I couldn't socialise. I dreaded seeing. So if I was like walking in a park or in town centre, I'd see someone, I'd hide. Yeah. I couldn't face people.
I really resonate with that. I think my solution was to get out of my hometown so I wouldn't have to face anyone.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to scrape the grades to get to university, which I did. And then after university, I worked away from my hometown in London, which meant I was avoiding all of what you're describing completely and numbing out in the ways that I've already described. So it wasn't until everything came crashing down for me after a short-term marriage that didn't go well at all, that, to be honest, I quite literally had a breakdown because all of this stuff, and this is the thing, no one can avoid all of this stuff forever. One way or another, we have to face ourselves eventually. There is no escaping that. And I did it the hard way that I wouldn't want anyone else to have to go through.
It's odd, isn't it? Like guys, we kind of just try and carry on until we can't, until we reach that breaking point. And it's really upsetting that it has to get to that point before then we go, okay. And even then we might not accept help, but realise that something needs to change.
It's such a common story. Part of that is because of the world within which we live in and the conditioning that we've all had. Even if it's conditioning that isn't intentional, like part of what it is to be a man historically especially, and what we've been handed down generation after generation is to, we've already touched upon it, not experience our emotions fully, not to ask for help. But I think I'm so passionate about trying to reach men way before it gets to crisis. And I do believe that we are going through a shift. Yes, there's a lot of talk around men in terms of problems, and there are a lot of problems that men need to face up to, violence against women and girls, and to name a big one, the manosphere, there's a lot of talk around that, and it's really important. I don't want to minimise any of that, but I think that's one solution to the same problem, which is that men don't have emotional privilege in our society still, growing up. Even things like the phrase "big boys don't cry," I still hear that all the time when there's a little boy crying. Be a brave boy. Like we're teaching young men to shut down emotionally from an early age, but we are emotional beings regardless of what gender we are. So the sooner we can actually embrace our full humanity as boys, adolescents and men, the less likely I think it is that we'll get to crisis, because the more normalised it will be to be more congruent and to recognise when we need to ask for help and to then take that action. I think it's such a big societal shift that needs to take place that I hope we're starting to see the shoots, even despite a lot of the increasing problems that coexist with that. It's a big topic.
It is. It is very big. And what struck me was, so before I had my thing with depression, which I didn't realise at the time, I'd only ever heard of mental health as like a throwaway comment. And I think the first time I heard it was Prince William and Harry talking about the mother of Princess Diana and about their own mental health issues. But it was just 2 words. There was nothing attached to it. And so I didn't know what depression was. I didn't know what anxiety was. I mean, there's loads of other ones, but I had no idea what that was. It's only retrospectively, I was anxious. I was depressed.
Yes.
And I think it's really important that we, as a society, just include this in education, in schools and colleges, because I didn't know I was like that. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, really.
I think it's a really great observation. And I guess it all depends how you look at these things. But for me, we tend to view things like anxiety and depression as a problem to be fixed rather than just a state of being. So if we look at how part of how we're formed is that we have a nervous system which is very sensory and is connected to all of our brain, but especially the most primitive part, that amygdala. So for me, I think there's a lot going on in our nervous system that we have no awareness of. We might do biology at school, but we don't necessarily think about our human experience quite so much, which is very subjective, and it's based upon who we are naturally, but also the experiences that we have day to day. So we're to be able to think about anxiety and depression in a different way, rather than a clinical diagnosis, to think about it as a state of being. That one of the models that I really like to think about is something called the window of tolerance, which is quite a well-known model, which just says that, look, quite literally, if we are living within our window, which is individual for all of us, some have wider windows than others, we're going to be able to cope with the highs and the lows of life. And that window isn't fixed, it moves.
What's it based on? What's the width and the sides?
So for me, it's about it's quite literally what can our nervous system tolerate in life? So what are we capable of experiencing without either going into hyper arousal, one of which symptoms can be anxiety. So if we are overstimulated all the time, if we're overstressed, then a nervous system is just on alert all the time, that fight flight response. Whereas, and it's often thought of as above the window. Below the window, we've then got shutdown, which is a nervous system unable to deal with the overwhelm. So instead of being on high alert, it just closes down. And part of that experience can be depression. I like to think of all of this as just part of the human experience, which is based on a whole series of variables, rather than it is something which is a diagnosable condition in the same way as like a broken leg is a diagnosable condition. I think it's more nuanced than that. I think it's more individual than that. And therefore the symptoms can be different in different people because of that.
So might be going down a different track here. Is it like your mental capacity to deal with things? Does that come into it?
It's part of it, yeah. But I think, I mean, to widen the discussion, when we think about, if I say to you mental health, what part of your body do you think of?
My head.
Yeah, and the brain.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of common understanding of mental health is that. For me, I struggle with the term mental health a little bit because what we're doing is we're cutting ourselves off at the neck up, and a lot goes on in here. A lot goes on in our body. Like, we don't feel our emotions in our head. We feel them in our body. So I think for me, the capacity of what we're capable of dealing with, a big part of that is how connected we are to ourselves, how honest we can be with ourselves, how we understand our own experience and what we give ourselves the privilege to look at. And look, everybody's life's different. Some people have more privileges than others. That's just a fact. And if you are a man and you are having to work every hour of the day to keep a roof over your head and to, you know what I mean? You've got real, genuine, daily struggles. You don't necessarily have the privilege to sit down and journal and a lot of what we've been talking about. We have to honour that, you know? So their window of tolerance is probably going to be a lot thinner, maybe, than somebody that has a well-paying job, gets weekends to themselves, doesn't have kids as well, all that kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that the guy that is having to work every other day to keep a roof over his head is always going to struggle, and the guy that has the well-paying job and space is never going to struggle. Sometimes it's the opposite, and that's why I'm saying it's very nuanced and personal.
So is there an objective there to increase the size of the...
This, I believe that when we take action, and it starts with what we do for ourselves daily, and that doesn't have to mean hitting the gym at 5 a.m. every morning. It might just mean 5 minutes when I wake up, before I get my phone out, before I do anything, I ask myself, how am I feeling right now? And just by doing that and meeting ourselves where we are, before we think about work and everything that's to come in the day, meeting ourselves where we are can allow our nervous system to relax and our window to open. But if we wake up and we're immediately on our phone and we're taking new information in, we're putting stress on ourselves often before we even think about living our life. So there are, I believe, practical things that we can do as men to give ourselves an all-rounded health, to be able to extend our window, to deal with life in a much more proactive way and increase our capacity for what we're able to cope with.
Would you say then that the first step is, I don't know, becoming aware of what we're doing already in that audit? So like what you said, looking at your phone instantly.
Absolutely. Meeting yourself where you are and say, look, how am I spending my time? And really being honest with ourselves about that. And I think it's one of the hardest things to do, because a lot of us have grown up with difficult habits that we don't really want anyone else to know about. We feel a lot of shame around. So we go through them and we don't often give them a second thought. So I think when we can shine a light on some of these things and be honest with ourselves about who we are. So one might be, when I'm emotionally heightened, I binge eat. I go straight to Domino's and I order myself a pizza and I just smash it. It might be that I sink a few beers. It might be that I turn to porn. Like, these are common things that men use to self-soothe.
Yep.
When things are emotionally difficult for them. I want to normalize that, and instead of shaming ourselves for that, say, look, these were our best attempts at coping mechanisms, but actually I don't want to spend the rest of my life smashing a Domino's, necking a load of beers, or turning to porn to cope with my life.
Yeah.
That doesn't feel empowering for me, and I've done all those things. So for me, it's about being curious about, well, what could I do instead? What would be a more empowering situation when I feel the urge to order the pizza, have the beers, or look at porn? What can I do instead? And to start there, because you're using that time already, which is why one of the things that sometimes men say to me that think about working with me, or when they're early working with me, they say, I don't have time to look at my habits. I don't have time to like change my life. It's like, well, you kind of do if you're really honest with yourself. Most of us do. So I say start there. Be real with yourself. What are the choices that you're making that almost feel like impulses, which you know you don't really want to be doing? Be compassionate, not judgmental, but then start to be creative about it and say, well, what could I do instead? Maybe it is journaling.
I like that.
Maybe it's something else.
Almost recognizing your own patterns.
Exactly that.
And then looking at what's a more empowering thing that you can do. And then just, I guess, trial and testing what works for you.
I think so. And it starts with those habits for me. Like, that's the foundation of everything. But often, especially, a lot of social media content around, men's coaching, men's work, all that kind of stuff tends to be around physical fitness and about doing more. Whereas I take a different approach, not that physical fitness and that isn't important, but I think actually it's very often about doing less. Or, as we were just saying in that example, making exchanges of one thing that isn't helpful for us for another that is more helpful. That has such a big impact, but it's often really just ignored. No one wants to talk about it because it's uncomfortable.
It's an interesting way, it's an interesting perspective because, like you say, most people want you to do more than fitting more in.
Yes.
It's probably not going to help you as much as just recognising and meeting yourself where you are.
Exactly. You will definitely get some benefits if you go to the gym more than you've been going. Which is why it's such a common thing. And it's also accessible. It more naturally feels better for more men than not to focus on that, to try and improve themselves. And I think it can. And I think it does in a lot of cases. But I work with a lot of men that are some of the fittest and the strongest men that you will meet, and it hasn't resolved their issues and it hasn't resolved their habits. In fact, it's created further problems because they get perfectionist about how they look, which they didn't before. So again, it's a very personal thing. I don't think it is good or bad on its own terms. But the point you made then is exactly the point that I try and get across, is that it's about meeting ourselves where we are, being honest about that, and often doing less and being more intentional about what we do. If you, in the next 30 days, if you were to map those habits, what's true for you, and say, okay, the next time I feel this, I'm going to notice I feel it, but I'm going to reach for my journal. I'm just going to sit with that impulse rather than following it. What happens in me? What do I start thinking? How do I start feeling? And noticing that. And if you can get through to the other side when that impulse goes, which usually takes about 5 minutes, it will feel like about 5 hours, but it's 5 minutes, and you can do that every day, you can quite literally transform how you feel about yourself and what you think you're capable of. Those limiting beliefs, for example, they start to shift really quickly.
I guess it's almost like a case of stop chasing the short-term pleasure, because we know what's good for us and what's bad for us, and we know in that instance it's a good feeling, but afterwards we're going to beat ourselves up about it, probably like eating a Domino's.
And I think that it's just tuning into what's true for you.
Yeah.
I still love a pizza, do you know what I mean? I still like a few beers, but not all the time, and definitely not when I know I'm feeling something that I'm activated. And what I'm doing is I'm doing one of those two things, or anything else for that matter, which is going to numb that experience. It's being able to fully feel my feelings and move through them that allows them to complete, which widens my window and my capacity to live my life in a way that feels more aligned for me. That's what we're really talking about here. And what's true for me may not be true for you, it may not be true for anyone listening, but the principle, I think, is the same. That when we can be who we are authentically in our life, we're probably going to be all right.
Yeah, no, I like that. So in advance of someone being in those states, I'm just trying to think for the listeners here, they could in advance write a list of things that they could do instead of, we've spoken about journaling, maybe meditation or trying something new.
100%. Or maybe it's listening to your favourite song. Like, it doesn't have to be like some big practice. Do you know what I mean? But I think it's just making the shift. But absolutely, like you said, the kind of audit, if you like, the reflection is what kicks it off, and being real with yourself about what's true for you with how you're currently living your life. Because without that, you're not being real with yourself. You know, you can make changes and improvements without doing any of that, and that may have some benefits. But ultimately, if you want that congruence, if you want that window to be as wide as possible for you, if you want to really start believing I'm capable of building a life for me that matches the potential that somewhere inside me I know I have, and not being subject to what my current beliefs are about myself, and that this is all I can expect of myself, which I think a lot of men feel, then yeah, you have to start by being real with yourself and compassionate.
So is it a case of someone listening and kind of knowing that they're not happy with where they are? Is that the identity?
I think so. It's tuning into your experience. So the identifying things are really important, which is why the second most important thing for me is to begin to understand your emotional experience. Because a lot of us, when we feel big emotions as men, will point to the thing that's caused us to have the reaction. I mentioned earlier in the pod about being cut up as a driver. Now, we might have an emotional reaction to that. If I'm already stressed, if there's lots going on for me, I'm more likely to have that reaction. And if I'm really honest with myself, I've probably stopped doing the things that I know are good for me, which means I've got to that point where that has happened outside of me. And that's why I've reacted. Now, it's easy for me to put all of the responsibility of that experience on the driver that's cut me up. But actually, the bigger part of that responsibility is me and what I brought to that situation. And I think that's why taking responsibility for ourselves, being real with what's true for us, is so important. Otherwise, we can blame everybody for everything and be a victim of our own lives.
Almost like taking control of what you can control, which is yourself, and not living in a state of reaction where we're reacting to people.
And that's the leadership part. I prefer leadership rather than control, because leadership is about authenticity and ownership, responsibility. You know, control has connotations for this is just me personally, which I'm a little bit uncomfortable. Control feels more oppressive to me. Does that make sense? Like we're trying to minimize something. We're trying to keep something under wraps. Whereas leadership, ownership feels much more empowering. And does that make sense?
Yeah, and I like it because a lot of the time we don't look at language and how we use language, but that's a very good indication there.
I think so. And a big part of my coaching, that's what I try to look at, because it can really give indication of who we are and how we view ourselves and the world outside us. It's not everything. They're all just clues. But yeah, I was really happy that you picked up on that, because I think it's really important.
So you've got a wealth of knowledge behind you, a wealth of experience with like coaching people. I wonder if there's any other key things that you see that men sort of struggle with.
I think there's a lot of things. Where do we start? And it depends how we define struggle as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think some men go on quite happily without ever really developing a self-awareness, except that this is the life they're going to live and who they are, and they don't need any more than that, and that's okay. I don't think this is about all of us trying to be superhuman at all, but I think it is about being real. So I think maybe the thing that men struggle with the most, the most that comes up for me over and above what we've already spoken about is how do they show up as partners and fathers? I think, are they playing a role in those two relationships that they feel they have to play? Or are they able to, with their partner, sometimes be vulnerable and let their partner lead and be responsible? And in order to do that, have men been able to develop skills to hold space for other people, their kids? Can they hold space for their kids, or are they just the authoritarian and the disciplinarian? And all of these things are really important. And I think a lot of men struggle with the weight of playing a version of themselves again, which is what it comes down to always for me, in their personal relationships.
So is it a case of they have multiple identities and conflicting, or?
Well, it can be, yeah, I think it can be. Sometimes it might just be that actually they're just a little bit afraid to be vulnerable and say, can you take care of this with the kids? Like, whatever it might be. And to ask for your needs and to know what your needs are as a man. That's really important in our closest relationships. I mentioned right at the very beginning when I was talking about my experience with my own father. And I think that, he did the best that he could, I believe, with who he is, like most of us do, which is another reason to feel compassionate. But nevertheless, if all we do is live our lives without actively trying to look at parts of how we show up and the quality of relationships we have with ourselves and other people and think, is there anything I can do better or differently? We're going to repeat the same version of ourselves for the rest of our lives. For some people, as I said, that's fine because they feel okay with that. But if you don't feel okay with that, all of us are only here once. The thought of having to live a life where you are performing as versions of yourself because you feel that's your duty to do so, but inside you may not be struggling, but you might just feel lonely. It is a common experience for a lot of men that I work with. There's a loneliness there because no one really knows who they are.
And from drawing on my personal experience as well, mentally taxing as well and draining.
That's the bit that can't easily be measured. It can't. It's very experiential. It's a personal thing. But you're right. The performance of all of that, energetically, it's draining. And I quite physically and mentally and emotionally can't do that anymore. And when I notice I'm doing it, which I do sometimes, I have to take steps to remedy that as quickly as I can.
So I want to switch it back to yourself. So how does Nick maintain his own, I know you don't like the phrase mental health, but...
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's not like I said, I don't think it's bad. I just don't think it takes us straight here. And I think we're more complex than that. That's how I describe it. But look, for me, it's the foundational practices that count. So me and my partner, we live together. We start our day, and look, I will insert this caveat that we have the privilege of not being parents, especially parents of young kids. So this may not be possible for everybody, but for me and for Jess, we have to start the day by checking in with ourselves. So we do breath work and meditation for a few minutes together so that we can create an atmosphere which is grounded before we even think about what we're going to do that day. Like, that's so important to start the day as refreshed and as energized as possible. Part of that meditation for me, because I want to be clear about meditation, because sometimes that can bring, I don't know, maybe a view of someone sitting cross-legged in the mountains in a far-off country kind of thing, and clearing your mind of thoughts. I think meditation is completely the opposite of that. I think it's just about being able to get rid of any distractions and to learn to be with what is going on for you, up here and in here, and just to be with it, not to judge it, not to become it, not to worry about it, but just to be with it. But then I think if you can bring some creativity to that little period, and we're only talking like 15 minutes here, if you can then bring, okay, I'm going to bring it into focus now, I've grounded myself, what's coming up for me today? Right, okay, I've got these clients or this podcast or whatever it is coming up for me, or this job to do, these tasks to complete. Who do I want to be? Which version of myself do I want to bring to all of this? or in the case of us sitting here, I want to try and be as open and as present as I can be. So I quite literally imagine myself meeting you and sitting here and soothing myself and saying, this is who I'm going to be. And I'm going to deal with any fears or nervousness that I have, which I had moving, before coming in here. We've never met personally before. Like, that's part of my process. But I want to be as open and as friendly and hopefully give as much value as possible. So I imagine that for a few seconds. That's my morning stuff. And then in the evening, it's about consciously switching off as much as I can before going to sleep to give myself as quality sleep as I possibly can. During the day, between those 2 points, it's about little check-ins, maybe 3 or 4 times. So after each client, for example, I will take 5 minutes, clear off any energy that I might be feeling or residue so that I can then be fully present for what comes next. So really, the total amount of time daily I spend on all of that is probably not even an hour, but it makes all the difference to how I show up in the rest of my day. It makes all the difference. And when I don't do all of that, which happens sometimes, I notice the difference. I really notice the difference. I struggle.
I saw like a framework previously, which was like doing things so you're at like a baseline. So that might be your baseline, doing those things. And if you don't do that, then you're not at that baseline. And I think that was quite interesting to understand and reflect on what is our baseline. We all know what we could do to be better tomorrow, like you say. We all know, if we're not sure, reverse engineer it. Well, I know if I stay up late, I'm not going to bring my best self to the podcast. Yeah. I'm not going to be my best self for my clients. And almost reverse engineering that.
I love that. It's exactly that. There's no one way to do it, but it's exactly that. And it's also being able to be kind and say, if I'd woken up and just wasn't feeling great, feeling a bit under the weather, I have to accept that I probably can't be that 100% version of myself, but maybe I can be 80%, and therefore 80% is who I'm going to be that day, because that's the best I can be. That makes a massive difference.
Again, the self-compassion.
I know, so it just comes out.
Oh, it's really, really good. Like, for someone who's previously been very self-critical of themselves, it's reassuring to hear about self-compassion and how important it is and how much it's impacted yourself.
It has. And I do urge anyone listening, if there's one thing they take out of this conversation, it is to kind of explore self-compassion. One of the leading experts on self-compassion is Dr. Kristen Neff, who has a website, I think it's compassion.org. It's a free access to a load of materials, information, guided meditations, things like that you can just explore the theme of self-compassion and just start to learn about it. I think accessibility with all of this stuff's really important. Like, I'd love to be able to give everything away for free, but I have to make a living, so I can't. But nevertheless, if you're curious and you want to just explore it and it's new for you, I would definitely start. That's a great place to start.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
No worries.
So the final question of the podcast, I feel like we could talk for hours.
Yeah.
What does mental resilience mean to you?
Resilience. What a word. I love it. I love the word now. I used to find it really crunchy and clunky, because in the same way that vulnerability meant weakness, resilience would mean an absence of weakness. And actually, neither of those things are true for me. For me, mental resilience is being able to meet ourselves where we are at any given point in time. And sometimes that might mean, if something's really important to us, that pushing through is something that's worthwhile doing, and that's okay. But it also means that sometimes it's going to be about not doing that and actually doing the opposite. And being resilient in that case means resting.
Yep.
And I think that's just as important as pushing through, but we often think of resilience as pushing through.
Again, a little bit of the self-compassion and recognising yourself and knowing yourself.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And that self-awareness, we can't have self-compassion without self-awareness. And therefore self-awareness begins by meeting us where we are, which has been another theme of what we've spoken about.
Wow. Well, Nick, thank you very much for coming on. I've really, really enjoyed that. And
Me too.
I've got a lot out of it.
No, look, thank you so much. Thank you. And I hope if you've listened to this, you can take something away from it.
Thank you, Nick.
Cheers.